Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. I really have to step up the pace here a bit. I have 40 slides and 40 minutes. That's 1 minute per slide. I'll try and talk as quickly as I can, and I will sound a bit as if I was a makeshift Italian, probably, because I'm so quick. Anyway, so it's been a long day. You're probably a bit exhausted. Let's start then with some audience participation, fun. It's not going to be a yoga session, unfortunately. It's also not going to be a collective Urschrei experiment. Just imagine you are me. Imagine it is January 2017. You've just received an email. The email invites you to a conference at the University of Padua, June 2018. You've only read the title of the mail. You haven't scrolled down yet, so you don't know what it's about. And what you read is this: bridging gaps, creating links. Now, what do you make of that? We are humanists, not engineers, so we decide to take the gap and links reference metaphorically. But then figurative language can sometimes be a tricky thing, and sometimes when you're confronted with a metaphor, you just can't help a concrete image coming to mind. Now, in case you're getting worried where this is going to take you, we're not going to explore my psychopathology, but I will allow you to share the experience that I had when I read the title. So this is what Bridging Gaps, Creating Links triggered in me. And of course, we all know how this story will end. Okay, luckily, the experience of intellectual gaps and failed attempts at bridging it tends to be less dramatic. In our context, they present themselves as an intellectual problem, not as an overwhelming existential phenomenon. Be this as it may, relax, the experiment is over. I am I and you are you now again. So my idiosyncratic visual association hints at something, namely at an odd discrepancy among the quantitative and the qualitative aspect of the phenomenon under investigation. 3 of the 4 words in our title bear the connotation of unification and synthesis, bridging, creating, linking, which means that in a quantitative perspective, the normatively positive impression is by far more accentuated, but what stands out in the image associated by my mind is this: gaps, comma. How come? Why is it that the notion of division and fragmentation of lurking danger and risk can so readily form the conceptual backdrop to a discourse on methodological diversity? Why does the qualitatively negative overrule the quantitatively better represented positive? The answer is we've hit on a trope, and in this stance on the trope of the grand methodological and epistemological divide that separates the Geisteswissenschaften and the Naturwissenschaften, the humanities and the sciences, as opposing domains of knowledge, experience and practice, as distinct cultures, as C.P. Snow put it so provocatively in his 1959 Reed lecture. Gaps and ruptures bear a negative connotation. They trigger an impulse to either avoid or to span and close them. But before we deliberate how to cross our present divide, the one between qualitative and quantitative methods of textual study, let us spare a moment of philosophical reflection on how the concept, the imagery, and indeed the ideology of a divided methodological terrain has come about and shaped our disciplines. The idea to conceptualize epistemological domains in terms of distinct worlds originates in classical antiquity. According to Plato, our mind has 2 principal faculties, that of mental anamnesis, of intellectual remembrance of that which is true and eternal and which exists in the realm of ideas, and the faculty of empyreia, the faculty of sensual perception of that which is fleeting and permanent and exists in the world of things. In Plato's philosophical perspective, The ontological distinction between things and ideas thus plays out as an epistemological distinction between two ways of acquiring knowledge about things and ideas. Granted, not everybody will subscribe to Plato's idealist premise, to his axiom that ideas which are not bound to matter and its constant transformation are more real than things. But whether you are a materialist or an idealist, Plato's discovery of the necessary conceptual mapping between ontology and epistemology will nevertheless stand as a cornerstone of all rational philosophy. For Plato goes beyond merely positing distinct worlds or realms of reality, such as the secular versus the divine, or the permanent versus the impermanent. Rather, he points to the fundamental methodological consequence of ontological dualism. As soon as we decide to conceptualize the world in terms of distinct domains, we must also be prepared to accept that the method and the mode of acquiring knowledge about any of these domains will necessarily be domain-specific. Time and again, philosophers have taken recourse to this finding and pointed out that it simply does not make sense to try and acquire knowledge, that is, to find out systematically what is the fact and what is not with regard to the domain under investigation, by applying a conceptually inadequate method of inquiry. For example, to prove the existence of God via rational discourse is one of these cases, as Immanuel Kant argued in his 1781 Critique of Pure Reason. Plato's appeal to methodological rigor did, however, not go uncontested. There's also a tradition of argumentation to the contrary. Take, for example, Kant. As soon as 18th century romantics had absorbed his philosophy, the vision of bringing the distinct methodologies into a mutually beneficial and productive relation again was born. In 1821, the German writer Heinrich von Kleist thus stated, "I can formulate a differential equation and I can formulate a verse. Are these not the two peaks of human competence? I am sure someone will employ me in a salaried position soon." And against the backdrop of this all but modest self-advertisement, he then went on to state, one could sort humans into two classes, the class of those who are competent in dealing with metaphors, and in that of those who are competent in dealing with formulae. Those competent in both regards are too few. They do not form a class. Of course, Kleist thought of himself as part of the avant-garde of this evolving class of humans who would combine aesthetic as well as mathematical abstractive competencies. But unfortunately, the 19th century turned out to rather deepen the divide. As the modern natural sciences began to rise, the domains of metaphor and formula drifted further and further apart, and the Renaissance ideal of a coherent universitas of disciplines and methods faded away. Disciplines became increasingly defined not only by their respective object domains, but also by their repertoire and type of methods. One such method was hermeneutics. The practice of methodical text interpretation had, of course, been around for centuries in the form of biblical exegesis, but it was only in 1808 that the classicist Friedrich Ast coined the term hermeneutic in order to codify how textual interpretation had to be practiced as a scholarly method. An exemplary and very influential adaptation of the method was then presented by Friedrich Schleiermacher in his 1838 Hermeneutik und Kritik, which combined theological and philosophical reasoning. However, outside the theological and classicist discourse, the impact of hermeneutics on then contemporary philological practice remained marginal. At the beginning of the 19th century, most of the evolving modern philologies were still more concerned with collecting and editing language-specific bodies of texts, corpora, rather than with interpreting individual works. The meteoric rise of the modern natural sciences changed the picture dramatically. These new sciences were not only defined by their subject areas, but also by their experimental methodology. The old sciences, the liberal arts in particular, did of course also have methods and terminologies, but they lacked such a clear-cut and distinctive methodological self-awareness. At the end of the century, Wilhelm Dilthey thus published his study Die Entstehung der Hermeneutik, in which he tried to show how the historical development of one particularly scholarly method of text interpretation, hermeneutics, had brought about the cluster of historical disciplines which we nowadays refer to as the humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften. And as in Plato, the ontological and the epistemological argument go hand in hand again. Dilthey writes, of course, the humanities have the advantage that their object is not an appearance presented in the senses, a mere reflex of something real within our consciousness, but rather the immediate reality itself, and this as a continuum experienced from within. Dilthey proceeded to point out that the immediacy of this inner reality, this experience, which need not be mediated by the senses, also poses a particular epistemic problem. How is it possible to gain objective knowledge from a subject-centered point of view? The answer lies in intersubjectivity. Dilthey argues that in order to understand myself, my own inner reality, I must by necessity compare my self-experience to that of other individuals and vice versa. But by which method can I objectively understand your inner reality? Dilthey argues as follows. A foreign existence is initially presented only in the form of essential facts as gestures, sounds, and actions originating outside. It is only through a process of mimesis that we complement the inner reality of the individual signs that fall into our senses. We have to project everything from our own living existence. This process, by which we understand an inner reality via external signs, we call understanding. Such understanding extends from that of a child's babble to that of Hamlet or of the Critique of Pure Reason, from stones, marble, musically formed sounds, from gestures, words, and texts, from actions, economic orders, and constitutions, the same human mind may speak to us, requiring interpretation. What are the methodological consequences of this? Let us assume that my goal is to understand your inner reality. In order to do so, in the procedurally correct hermeneutic fashion, I have to combine two operations. One, exegesis. I must interpret as manifestations of your inner reality every individual sign by which that reality objectifies itself and becomes visible to me on the outside. Dilthey suggests that for pragmatic purposes, these signs should ideally be fixierte Lebensäußerungen, fixated life expressions, and the paradigmatic form of such an expression is the fixated linguistic utterance, the text. 2. Synthesis. I have to integrate all these individual signs, which I have interpreted as expressions of your inner reality, in order to reconstruct from them your complex inner experience of reality as a phenomenal whole. Moreover, the construction of that phenomenal whole is not merely additive, but it takes place under certain constraints, some of which are logical, such as non-contradiction, and others contextual, such as, for example, historical plausibility. Dilthey's Entstehung der Hermeneutik was essentially an attempt to supply the humanities, and in particular the philologies, with a methodological history and foundation ex post. At the same time, Dilthey's appeal to a practice of methodological rigor in textual and historical understanding also countered the claim for epistemological hegemony which contemporary positivism had already posed, thus ascertaining the legitimacy of the historical disciplines and of their focus on the subject-centered interpretation of text as signs of a lived experience of reality. And so it turns out that what we refer today as the quantitative approach is indeed, a qualitative approach, is indeed conceptually rooted in Schleiermacher's, Dilthey's, and Gadamer's notions of hermeneutic in an epistemology which is based on the premise that the phenomenon under investigation, the text, the image, the gesture, is merely the outer sign of an inner phenomenological experience in somebody's mind. The nexus between that mind, its subjective inner experience, and the objective outer sign is what we try to explore in a qualitative study. Now, with that ancestry in place, the methodological line of division seems to be clearly defined once again. Where the domain of inner experience of reality is concerned, hermeneutics is the appropriate method. Where the outer world is at stake, empirics will be the candidate of choice. But on closer inspection, it turns out that when Dilthey wrote his Geschichte der Hermeneutik, things were already not that easy any longer. For by the end of the 19th century, positivism's reach had already extended not only into the field of artistic creation, as testified, for example, by naturalist literary movements, positivism and empirical methods had also begun to affect humanities scholarship per se. The development of folklore studies between 1810 and 1927 serves to demonstrate this development. When the Grimm brothers compiled their famous collection of Kinder- und Hausmärchen from 1812 to 1858, this project aimed for an anthology that was inspired by the Romantics' mythological interest in sagas and folk tales. But from 1880 onwards, the focus in folklore studies suddenly shifted toward what became known as the historical geographical method of the Finnish school. This school foregrounded the genetic aspect and employed analytical and empirical approaches in order to retrace how and when narratives had originated and been distributed. At the beginning of the 20th century, these genetic studies eventually culminated in Anti-Arne's taxonomic index of fairy tale motifs, the first parts of which were published in 1910. This so-called motive register is conceptually based on an encyclopedic approach. It lists close to 5,000 so-called motives, that is, micro-narratives, that form the base-level building blocks of all fairy tales. This is, on the one hand, an impressive demonstration of the fruitfulness of an empiric approach in the study of oral and literary history, yet at the same time, the theoretical underpinnings of this, namely the clarification of what actually constitutes a motive, remained vague. But then the Russian formalist Vladimir Prop suddenly pushed for a further level of abstraction. In his 1928 Morphology of the Folk Tale, he presented a 31-function formula of the Russian fairy tale. And unlike his predecessors, who focused on collecting folk tales and on comparing them on a content level, Prop's functional approach described the phenomenon of the fairy tale no longer from an experiential perspective, but against the backdrop of a theoretical model. This, as Claude Lévi-Strauss, Claude Bremont, Thomas Pavel, and others later observed, was the actual birth of the formalist and structuralist approach to narratives and literature. Folklore studies, which had played a key role during the late 18th and early 19th century in building the construct of a national language-based identity by collecting narratives, had thus progressed from the encyclopedic to the taxonomic to the formal approach within a mere 80 years. And we can, of course, retrace similarly dramatic developments in, say, the development from 18th century Sprachgeschichte up to early 20th century Saussurian linguistics, or from the early 18th century Erfahrungsseelenkunde, the precursor of modern psychology, to Freud's late 19th century psychoanalytical theory. By the beginning of the 20th century, the latest, systematization, abstraction, and formalization impacted on many humanist disciplines. Reminding ourselves of this historical trajectory of disciplines and methods in the humanities is important for two reasons. One, it helps us to identify what one might jokingly term a cannibalization of humanities concepts by formalization. Two, it enables us to reflect on the process of interdisciplinary and intermethodological exchange at a more general level. As for cannibalization, Prop's 31-function formula of the Russian fairy tale presents a case in point. In 1975, when Prop's book had eventually been translated into English and was published in the US, his formula was discovered by the artificial intelligence researcher David Rumelhart. In an article titled Notes on a Schema for Stories, Rumelhart drew on Prop and presented a generative story grammar, which he claimed could in principle enable an artificial intelligence to generate stories. The article was visionary, Not only has it been cited in AI publications ever since, but up to this day, AI researchers interested in story grammars refer to Prop's formula as a conceptual blueprint. However, the artificial intelligence adaptation of Prop's model is based on a shortcoming which, in a hermeneutic perspective, boils down to a fundamental procedural mistake, namely interpretive ignorance vis-à-vis the historic and methodological context of the original text. Prop himself had pointed to this context not only by his choice of title, Morphology of the Folktale, but also by the inclusion of a motto taken from Goethe's 1817 publication Zur Naturwissenschaft überhaupt, besonders zur Morphologie, Erfahrung, Betrachtung, Folgerung durch Lebensereignisse verbunden. In this publication, Goethe discusses the pros and cons of morphology as a science, emphasizing that the, to quote, operations of the mind by which morphology groups phenomena are adequate to human nature and pleasant, so that even a failed morphological synthesis of the phenomena might still combine Nutzen und Anmut, usefulness and grace. If nothing else, Prop's use of this motto served the rhetorical purpose of an exculpatio. Whatever the case, Rumelhart's article was completely agnostic to this context, a fault which can only partially be held against him because the publishers of the first American translation of the book had in fact omitted the Goethe motto, and in the absence of this contextual information, Rumelhart and many other researchers with an interest in AI story generation had thus adapted Prop's formula, but they had not understood it in a hermeneutic sense. Which brings me to my second more general point. Can understanding in the strict hermeneutical sense indeed be posited as a normative prerequisite in interdisciplinary and intermethodological exchange? What is wrong with the cannibalization of an idea, concept, method, if it leads to an interesting result? The brief historical sketch which I have outlined so far is not meant to provide a normative framework. There is no point in passing judgment on the right or wrong, the do's and the don'ts of methodological gap closing, however agnostic or anachronistic it may seem. The point of a historical critique, I believe, is to realize the transformations which ideas and methods must necessarily undergo when we move them across methodological and interdisciplinary and disciplinary boundaries. And I, for one, believe that digital humanities is all about moving ideas, methods, concepts, and so forth across these boundaries, because the border itself is just a mere construct. The gap, the two cultures so provocatively proclaimed by C.P. Snow, the Manichaean distinction between close and distant reading, to which Moretti refers tongue-in-cheek, if we take these metaphors at face value, they all boil down to a self-perpetuating myth. This myth might, of course, serve the purpose of a disciplinary identity formation a contrario, but in a more enlightened epistemological perspective, there simply is no inherent divide between the qualitative and the quantitative perspective onto objects and processes. Rather, these two perspectives form a methodological continuum. And how that continuum can be explored is what I would now like to demonstrate with regard to one particular area of DH research, text analysis and annotation. As many have demonstrated, the distant reading of large text corpora with DH methods can nowadays produce highly interesting insights into the development of historical forms, genres, styles, themes, etc. over time. But it is a different type of knowledge altogether. The traditional historical and hermeneutic approach in literary studies was characterized by the in-depth analysis and interpretation of a small set of texts, often taken from an established normative literary canon. Most of the new digital methods trade this hermeneutic precision and ingenuity of closeness to the exemplary text for the statistical generalizability of results derived under the perspective of methodological distance. The new methods' interest in the qualitative and the singular and highly original text is of course only in part a conscious methodological choice. The analysis of really large text corpora is also subject to pragmatic constraints. We simply do not have the time and resources to process large numbers of texts manually, or rather intellectually, that is, by way of human intelligence-controlled processes of analysis, categorization, interpretation, critique, and validation, and so forth. In response to these pragmatic constraints, digital corpus analysis therefore relies heavily on data mining techniques, natural language processing technology, and statistical pattern analysis. All these methods prove extremely powerful the more they can ignore the contextually induced specificity of the phenomena under investigation, such as the historicity of a particular language variant, the genre specificity of a topic, and so forth. The exploration of context and its impact on meaning is still and remains the forte of hermeneutics, and not of statistical investigation, because in hermeneutics it is the specificity of constellations that counts, not their generalizability. One way to resolve what at first sight may look like a principled methodological impasse between the close and hermeneutic and the distant and statistical methods of text studies is to enrich digital text analysis with one of the oldest and probably the most powerful method of traditional studies in texts, annotation. As Lou Bernard stated already back in 2001, text markup is currently the best tool at our disposal for ensuring that the hermeneutic circle continues to turn, that our cultural tradition endures. Text markup can take many forms, and Matthias Bauer and Angelika Zirker have suggested this taxonomy: linguistic markup, formal markup, intertextual, contextual, interpretive. So you see it shifting towards the hermeneutic pole the further you go down this list. In other words, markup is something that can and is, on the one hand, a traditional philological and linguistic practice that can be readily employed in corpus-based, computer-assisted, and ideally fully automated research routines, for example, pos tagging. But markup, the more it becomes functionally equivalent to commentary and exegesis on a given digital text, can also serve as a prime demonstrator for the difficulty to support qualitative research into texts and corpora with digital means. And to support the exploration of this continuum, my team and I have developed since 2008 Katma, an open source digital text annotation platform that is freely available as a web service and is currently used by over 100 research projects worldwide. Katma stands for Computer-Assisted Textual Markup and Analysis. Katma's technology and architecture as a web service programmed in Java might be cutting edge. We use graph databases, modules for supervised machine learning routines that run in the background, a GitLab repository-based versioning approach, XML-TI conformant markup schemata, a powerful query language, etc., etc. But Katma's conceptual design is much older. It is that of the hermeneutic circle. And hermeneutic activity is indeed circular in two respects. Friedrich Ast, who coined the term hermeneutics in 1808, already pointed out that the foundational law of all understanding and knowledge is to find the spirit of the whole through the individual, and through the whole to grasp the individual. This is the circularity of the part-whole relationship. You see it here on the vertical axis, which points to the compositional aspect of understanding as an aggregate. And the second aspect is the processual one. It has been highlighted by, among others, Gadamer. There is no understanding of a phenomenon that does not depend on a, however vague, pre-understanding, and conversely no pre-understanding which does not already point back, at least implicitly, to an anterior understanding. Taken in conjunction, the compositional and processual circularity of the hermeneutic approach have concrete implications for the design of a tool that aims to support hermeneutic practice. In its conceptual design, such a tool must conform to the three methodological axioms of hermeneutics. It must combine iteration, intersubjectivity, and reflexivity. Now, in terms of Katma's design approach, these rather abstract considerations helped us to formulate 4 core requirements for a successful digital modeling of the hermeneutic circle. And here they are. You need to define a hermeneutically oriented text and metatext data model. You have to, secondly, rethink text annotation as a non-deterministic, proto-interpretive activity functionally connected to text analysis. Thirdly, you have to enable and support inter-annotator disagreement, horribile dictu. And fourth, you have to reconceptualize annotation variance as an indicator rather than as a procedural fault. And as for the first requirement, here is Katma's data model. What you can see here is that we have primary data, normally text. We have as metadata, as data on data, user-generated annotations and interpretations, which we stack. So there are variant annotations, and we have as what we call hermeneutic operators, tags and tag sets, but also more abstract and complex things such as theories and models, and all of those inform the process of text annotation and analysis. Now, machine-generated metadata is usually deterministic, but user, that is human-generated metadata, can and often will vary the less formal and the more interpretive a description is. This is why our model stacks in annotations and interpretations, as you can see in the upper left part of this slide. By stacking annotations and annotation variants, we can also answer this, the next 2 of our 4 conceptual requirements, the non-deterministic approach. So Katma can generate some automated base-level automated markup, such as pos tagging, but its main aim is to allow users to generate higher-level variant annotations, and thereby it also supports inter-annotator disagreement. So what does this look like in practice? You would load a text and find interesting words and phrases in your text by highlighting it. Anybody who can handle a mouse can do just that. You would then annotate these words that you have identified. It can be a single word, it can be an entire chapter. There's no limitation there. You can even highlight discontinuous phrases or segments of text. You apply a tag to that. In this case, somebody has highlighted toolbox and has chosen to put this into the category of material objects. So that person has given this word a tag, and this is stored in the software at the background. Now, the interesting thing is the system allows for real-time collaboration amongst annotators who annotate the same text or the same corpus, and these people, each of them does their own annotation. They can also modify the tags, they can introduce new tags, new tag categories, so they're not tied into a predefined taxonomy. They can develop it on the fly or change it or augment it on the fly, which is important because that's what normally happens when we work in a hermeneutic fashion. No hermeneutically working literary scholar has everything figured out before you actually start the job. And when you start the job of interpretation, you suddenly realize that, hey, I'm lacking a theory here or a concept there, and this is mapped onto the system design in this instance. So, but when we have this, obviously, this is where annotation variance creeps in. People annotate differently. Look at our toolbox there. Somebody else might decide that this is a metaphor, and indeed it is a metaphor in this particular text. So how do we deal with this now? One person is for the material object, underlined in blue. The other one is for the metaphor, for the concept, underlined in purple. We have to reconceptualize this annotation variance as an indicator rather than as a procedural fault. That's what I said earlier on. How do we do that? Well, this is taken from a lecture or a seminar that I'm running at present with students. We're annotating irony in the corpus of Goethe texts. This is the Wanderjahre, Wilhelm Meisters Wanderjahre in Goethe. And as you can see, there are instances where people, each color bar represents one person's annotation, where people agree, but there is also a lot of disagreement in here. The colors differ, even the spans differ. The system tolerates that. How do we work with this? How do we make sense of this? Well, if we could think of Dilthey once more, he says we have to project everything from our own living existence. That is, we have to look at these annotations as if we did them, and to first have to ask ourselves, well, what would they mean to us if we had done this particular annotation, even if we disagree with this particular choice of annotation category. This is where the hermeneutic circle under in a collaborative environment actually turns into a hermeneutic spiral, because we're not only talking to ourselves, we're not only spiraling through our own progression, circling through our own progression of understanding, but we're looking at what many people do. And if P on this spiral here is one person, one annotator, you can imagine that a lot of spiraling dynamics is in there. And on each point on this trajectory of the spiral, there is an indication of what Donald Hirsch has called significance, namely a relationship between a meaning and a person, a conception, a situation, and so forth. And that is what we want to explore. Coming back to the toolbox, this means we have to find a way to distinguish between good, productive annotation variants and nonsensical annotation variants, because of course there is also nonsensical disagreement. Let's not fool ourselves. This is how we deal with it. We developed a workflow where let's assume you've taken the first two steps of doing an annotation. You've defined your categories. You've annotated something. Sometimes you will revise your annotation categories even at that stage. That's still fine. But now you go one step further. You compare the annotations produced by two or more annotators, and you find out that there's variance. So you have, on the one hand, corresponding annotations. They're fine, they're green, but you also have conflicting annotations. Now, with these conflicting annotations, 4 scenarios are possible. One, there's merely an annotator mistake. Somebody got the category wrong. That's easy to remedy. You correct it. Second option is there's an inaccurate definition of annotation categories. Well, this can also be remedied by revising the annotation categories and then rerunning the process again. We're in iteration mode now, as you can see. Third option is we find out that 2 annotators were employing different conceptual frameworks. This is probably the most interesting case, because we can now try to define the conceptual framework for each annotator, which then allows us to redefine the annotation categories, or failing this option, we can at least do something like a meta-annotation, that is, annotate the annotation and ask the annotators to specify their conceptual framework. We built something like that into Katma, where you can actually annotate an annotation, and you can do that iteratively until the cows come home. So you can annotate and meta-annotate and so forth. This leads you to legitimate conflicting annotations, and of course for those of us working in literary studies, this is what we really like, genuine textual polyvalence. We have to allow for that as well. So this is how we deal with annotation variants and how we try to make it productive. In other words, context, which creeps in here, is conceptualized as a parameter in the annotation process, and this parameter should ideally be determined, described, defined, so that we can understand it and can analyze it. This subjective context, which plays a big role in higher level markup, is not just noise. It is something that is productive, that plays a very important role, and by making this context explicit, we can actually bridge the gap between quantitative and qualitative analysis, because here we can pinpoint it ideally. We're actually also data mining the descriptions that annotators give, the explanations that they give on their choice of annotation category to see whether we find consistent patterns in there or whether some arguments pop up that might warrant further investigation. On a whole, I think that if we talk about empirics and qualitative studies, we have to understand that this whole thing about quantitative, qualitative, distant reading, close reading is really a continuum, and that what really makes sense is to employ what my colleague Thomas Weitina has called scalable reading, that is to move this bar there between the two sides from one side to the other and possibly even back. That really depends on the type of text you're investigating or the corpus you're investigating. But you need the right tools to be able to do that. Most of the automated routines do not allow you to do this because they are interested in enabling a machine to do certain things more effectively, more efficiently than a human being. But let's face it, meaning is something that concerns us. I run a DH lecture every semester, and I always ask the students, what's the problem with computers? The answer is trivial. The problem with computers is that computers don't have problems. They don't have an existential dimension. They don't know what a phenomenon is. They know numbers, but this link back to the phenomenal is what we have as humans, and our tools should really cater for that as well. So, digital humanities' grand challenge, I think, is really to model this continuum of understanding, the phenomenological and empirical continuum of understanding, by conceptualizing symbolic artifacts in a holistic as well as in an analytic, formal mode. We have to support our research routines both as systematic and as intuitive routines. We have to combine linear input-output with iterative and discursive data models. Obviously, something like pos tagging lends itself to automation because you have a very robust taxonomy there, whereas something like meaning or metaphor is certainly on the other side of the spectrum. I don't know where anaphors are. They might be somewhere in between, or deixes might also be somewhere in between. There are interesting phenomena which we can locate somewhere in this continuum. We have to mediate between these approaches, the distant and the close perspective, by developing scalable models and processes. All in all, digital text research is really a three-dimensional thing where we have to think about methods, procedures, and functions. And on each of these axes, we can theoretically think of these axes along poles, such as deductive, inductive for the method, declarative, interpretive for the function, algorithmic, hermeneutic for the procedure, and then all in all, quantitative versus qualitative. So what about the gap then? Well, I think as for the gap, we can actually be a bit more relaxed. Thank you very much.